Welcome in to an episode of the Barnes on Bama live stream. Uh, Alabama got a huge win over Ole Miss. We're going to talk all about it. Going to give some time for people to join in. Did have one comment here up at the top. Looks like Thomas was unable to join us for the stream. He's got something going on, but wanted to open it up with kind of his comment about how big was Latrell Wrightsell in that one. Love seeing him in his old form. I mean, 100%. If you saw my preview that I wrote over on barnesonbama.com, as you often will see, if you're not subscribed to the channel, if you could do me a favor and subscribe, I would appreciate it. But barnesonbama.com or on my Twitter account, I always do the pregame threads breaking down the opponent, and I give my score prediction, I give my player to watch, and then I give you kind of a lot of ideas as it relates to the opposing team. I will say Ole Miss was actually a very tough one for me to preview because as you may have seen in this game, Ole Miss plays a lot of unique players. They even played some guys, and the announcers talked about it in this one that had only played in 13, 14 games. Malik Dia in this game is a guy who leads Ole Miss in rebounding, but he actually only played 8 minutes. Corey Chest, a guy who Alabama went after in the transfer portal, only played 9 minutes. So it's kind of difficult to know exactly what lineup Chris Beard's going to run out there on any given night. So I tried to do my best breaking down this game. However, the two things that I absolutely did in this game is my player to watch was Latrell Wrightsell. I thought that he was somebody who had been on a tear over the last few games. The Auburn game was one that obviously scared us with his knee injury. But once we saw that he was cleared to go, I knew that he was able to practice. So I thought that was really, really good. And then I also knew that Ole Miss's defense was going to be exactly what we saw. They allow a lot of skip passes, which allows a lot of assists and a lot of shots from deep. And it was really just a question of was Alabama going to make them? And that question was answered in the first half versus the second half. In the first half, you saw Alabama unable to make really any shots. Alabama shoots 23% from three. And however, Alabama's still up 2 points. And that's why at halftime, this one was pretty obvious. Hey, this game's over. Alabama's going to win this game, and it's potentially going to get pretty bad. And it's because you just know that Alabama's not going to shoot 23% for the whole game. You had missed a lot of open shots. It wasn't like they were forcing them, and they had just missed a ton of shots. And Latrell Wrightsell was my guy who I thought, hey, he would be the guy. And sure enough, Latrell Wrightsell ends up going 7 for 13 from three, over 50% from three, 13 attempts. It has to be a defense kind of like Ole Miss's if you're going to get off that amount of attempts. Think about it compared to like that Auburn game. You only got 23 off as a team. So it's just a different defense. And I knew that that was going to be something that Chris Beard was going to try to do. And that Alabama should be able to have a lot of success in that way. I thought that Latrell Wrightsell was going to be able to. And as I said, Wrightsell just was phenomenal. Miss Cindy, absolutely happy that Latrell had a great game. 100% agree with that. Roll Tide as well. When you talk about kind of when I looked at this game, the things that I look at for anybody who's followed the channel for any length of time, I look at the stats, obviously. I look at the KenPom page and I look at, kind of what they do, but I also want to know like how do they do it, right? And some of the things that kind of jumped off the page at me was Ole Miss, had only played 4 games. This is their 4th game over 71 possessions. So they don't play a ton of fast possession or, faster games, higher possession games. They had not been great in any of the higher possession games, save for the one they played against Louisiana Monroe. But Louisiana Monroe is ranked 350 in KenPom, so really can't consider that one. Their game against St. John's in Arkansas, they didn't look incredibly great. We knew that they were a slow possession team. You look at what they do on the offense side of the ball, they take a ton of mid-range shots. They're not very efficient. And because of that, you see a lot of scores where, yes, they win a game against Mississippi State, but it's 68-67. Yes, you win a game against Missouri, but you scored 76 points. The announcers pointed out Alabama has only lost one game this season in which the opponent scored under 80 points, and it was Tennessee, and they scored 79. Realistically, if you're going to beat Alabama, every team other than Purdue and Tennessee had scored at least 87. And most of the teams that have beaten Alabama have scored 92 or more, right? Ole Miss just was not built to play that kind of game. They don't have that kind of offense. Their defense isn't nearly what it was last season. They've definitely struggled, right? So it was pretty clear to me that Ole Miss was just clearly outmatched in this game. The other thing that I thought that was pretty clear was they just foul a lot, right? Ole Miss fouls a lot, and when you look at what Alabama had been able to do against Auburn last game, you thought that the free throws, if Alabama could keep up their free throw shooting, it could be a big deal. And that's something I wanted to point out because Alabama goes 24 of 26 from the line today. Absolutely incredible. London missed one, Philon missed one, but other than that, just a perfect night from behind the free throw line, and that's a really really big deal. I think that that's something that you could definitely see pay dividends down the stretch, whether it be in the SEC play or when you go into March Madness. I think that's a really big deal to know that your team consistently is able to make big free throws. And I think that, yes, LeBaron Filing goes 9 of 10, but I think that the number that is the biggest deal for me personally is Aiden Sherrill. Aiden Sherrill goes 6 of 6 again in this game. In SEC play, he has gone 1 of 1 against Kentucky. Then he went 10 of 11 against Mississippi State, 3 of 4 against Oklahoma, 1 of 2 against Tennessee, 7 of 9 against Missouri, 3 of 4 against Florida, and then he's 8 of 8, 2 of 2, and 6 of 6. He's actually 7th in the SEC in free throw shooting. That's something that has been a really, really big deal in what he's been able to really improve on this season. I just want to give Aiden a shout out for that because I think that Aiden Sherrill's ability to not only get fouled and play through contact, but additionally convert at the line has been huge. The fact that you can have somebody convert at the line as a big man as well as he's been able to just leads to the additional efficiency of your offense, and I think that it goes a long way in your ability to run the type of offense that Nate Oates wants to run. If you saw my episode that I did, I believe I predicted a score of I think it was like 86, 72. And then I bumped it up a little bit when I actually did the write up. I ended up predicting in the write up a score of 90 to 74. Taylor Boboen had to hit a three at the end of the game to mess up my prediction. But, overall, I thought that, this one, like I said, was pretty clear. I thought that Alabama was going to have a lot of open looks from three. I thought that Ole Miss was going to struggle to score a ton of points. That happened. I thought that AJ Storr honestly looked really good in this game. I thought that his ability to come in that first half and kind of put the team on his back when Ole Miss had a big lead, but if you were looking at it as like, oh yeah, Ole Miss is just killing Alabama, they're shooting way better. They weren't really shooting substantially better than Alabama. AJ Storr was just shooting better. He was 5 of 5 early, and was doing really, really well. However, when he picked up that second foul, I believe it was like 8:30 to go in the first half. That was the turning point in this game, in my opinion. Alabama still struggled to score there for another couple of minutes. I believe it was the first 15 minutes of this game, Alabama scored just 15 points. And then in the final 5 minutes of this first half, they scored 17. And then they go on to score 61 points in the second half. So just an absolutely insane second half. I thought that Alabama did a really, really good job overall on offense in this game. And when you look at that, Houston Millette only goes 1 of 8 from three, and many of those were open threes. LeBaron Fallon goes 1 of 4, not his best shooting night. Latrell Wrightsell, yes, he made 7 of them. Most of his misses were open as well, right? There were shots that were left on the table. Aiden Holloway goes 2 of 6, right? I thought that, a couple of shots he made were huge, of course. But there were definitely shots that were left on the table. I thought that was the big difference in the first half and the second half of this game. It's just Alabama missed plenty of open shots. And I think that's one of the more impressive parts of this game for me is that Alabama actually finished with 20 assists, which is a great number. However, that number probably should be, at least 6 or 8 higher if Alabama just converts on some shots that were wide open, right? It's not even that Alabama was forcing threes and was taking shots they shouldn't have taken. They actually were taking the shots that you would expect them to take, but as poorly as they did shoot in that first half, and that 20% we talked about, they ended up shooting 37% for the game, or 30, almost 38% for the game from three. And when you make 17 threes and your opponent only makes 8, that goes a long way in your ability to win in this game. And then additionally, you're making an extra 16 points from the free throw line because of Ole Miss fouling. And that's something they've had a problem with this season. you know that LeBaron Fallon's a guy that does a really, really good job getting to the free throw line, but Aiden Sherrill doing that as well. I thought that was a really big deal for Alabama to be able to convert at the line, to get to the line as much as they did. On the rebound side of this one, I thought that Alabama may be able to have a little more success in the offensive rebounding. I think that part of the problem in that first half was a lot of the rebounds were really, really long. And so Ole Miss actually was able to get a decent number of those. And Alabama's shooting was just completely out of rhythm in that first half. So early in this game, you saw Ole Miss have a really, really big rebound advantage. I think it was like 15-7 at one point. And it was mostly on the back that Alabama just didn't have the opportunity for the offensive rebounds due to how the kicks were coming off the rim, off of the long threes. And Ole Miss was making a lot of shots, whereas Alabama was missing a lot of shots. So Alabama didn't have the ability to get a defensive rebound because they were having to pick it out of the net. And Ole Miss had plenty of ability to get defensive rebounds because Alabama was missing everything. However, then at the end of this game, Alabama actually does win the rebounding battle in this one on both sides by 5 total. So, they win that. They win the turnover battle by 2. So Alabama wins the possession battle in this game. And that's something that Nate talks about a lot is, winning the possession battle, both with the offensive rebounds and the turnovers. And just overall rebounds in general. But the offensive rebounds and the turnovers being a good combination to let you know who's won the rebound or who has won the possession battle. And Alabama winning it by 5 is something that I'm sure Nato's going to be very, very happy about in this, or winning it by 4, I'm sorry, is going to be very, very happy about in this one. Brock saying Latrell shot the lights out. Absolutely. We know that guy is capable of shooting the absolute lights out. Him and Aiden Holloway are two of the best shooters that Alabama's ever had. Latrell Wrightsell is a guy that you knew that the shooting percentage that you saw early in the season at, low 30s was just not realistic and not something that you expected to continue. Latrell Wrightsell is currently 5th in conference, shooting the 3 at 43.8%. You knew that was what he was capable of, and some of the 2 of 14 game against UTSA was just realistically not going to continue. So there's a reason why NATO wants him to just keep shooting the basketball. That 44% guy that took us to the Final Four, and some of the other abilities that we saw for Latrell, we knew is what he's capable of. So not to say that you fully expect this. I don't know that I could say how I expect him to make 7, but Latrell Wrightsell shooting really, really well from behind the arc. 5 to 6 is definitely 4 to 6 is definitely a number that is attainable any night for him. And of course, he's able to make 7 if he goes on a tear. And if you give him 13 threes, somebody as good as him is going to be able to make those. It's kind of like Aiden Holloway. If you give Aiden Holloway a ton of threes like last season. I know the team, was it South Dakota State, I think, gave him 19 shots from deep. And Nate got mad at him for passing up a couple. But, when you give a shooter that good, that many attempts from deep, he's going to make a bunch. Corey Chest, mid. I think that Corey Chest needs to be in a different role. And I think the problem is Ole Miss needs him. Ole Miss needs scorers on the floor because their offense in general is just bad. So unfortunately, they need guys who are multifaceted on the offensive side of the ball. And if you're not multifaceted on the offensive side of the ball and can't do multiple things, they don't need you. So I don't know that he's particularly bad. I think that he would honestly fit our system better than he would fit theirs because we wouldn't need him to be that offensive dominant factor. You would just need him to be a good defender and a good rebounder. I think that is more of the ability of, what we would need him to be, a lob target, a defensive guy, a rebounder. And I think that he would be a much better impact in that type of role versus Ole Miss. Like I said, they just don't have the offense. You're not going to beat the teams with likes of Alabama. You're not going to beat a Kentucky. You're not going to beat an A&M. You're not going to beat a Georgia very often unless you can score a lot of points. Now, they did end up beating Georgia. They were able to take them to overtime, but if you see, they scored 95 points in that game, right? That was a game that Ole Miss was actually able to score a decent amount of points. When you look at like their upcoming games against Texas A&M and Florida, I mean, even Auburn and Vandy, like they're going to definitely struggle because they do not have the offense. And I just don't think Corey Chest is going to change that. That doesn't mean that I think Corey Chess is a bad player. I think that he has a decent defense, decent rebounding. I just don't think he's what they need. And um, they won the recruiting battle with him, so props to them. But I don't think that he is going to change a ton for them, and that's the reason why you saw him play 9 minutes in today's game. Malik Dia goes 1 of 5 from the arc, 0 of 2 from the free throw line, gets pulled, plays just 8 minutes in the game, right? They weren't exactly what you needed, and because of that, that becomes a major problem. Um, I think that they have some things with Klafke and some others. I think that their European guys are definitely giving them something, but I mean, they had two guys in double figures, and AJ Store was really the only offense they had. And what happens when AJ Store doesn't have as good of a night as he had tonight? And that's what you've seen in some of these more recent games, like against Texas. AJ Store, they played him just 14 minutes. He had just 7 points, and they had major problems in that game. He hit 7. He had an insane night. Absolutely. Like I said, anytime you can make 7 threes in a night, you've had a phenomenal one. Ole Miss with the terrible offense. Uh, so you said they made it official on the tight ends coach. Let's see. I didn't have Twitter pulled up, but let's see what we've got. So it looks like Richard Owens is Alabama's next tight ends coach. He previously was Louisville's offensive line coach. However, has both played tight end in college as well as in the NFL. I think that that's a big deal due to the fact that it gives you another offensive line coach on the t- on the coaching staff, and to me, that just gives you so much more. Because obviously what Alabama wants to do with their tight ends, I don't think that Alabama is looking at its tight ends to all the time be, massive receiving threats. I think that they're at times a bit of a extension of the offensive line with their, inline blocking on the running side of the ball and such. So I think it's a big deal, obviously, to have a guy that has offensive line experience, but then also to have a guy that has playing experience in both college and the NFL. I think is a big deal. Um, I would think, additionally, tight end coach probably is, um, in theory, a lesser job than offensive line. So the fact that you're able to get a guy to take in theory, pay may be similar, but in theory, a step down job. But to come to Alabama from Louisville, I think is a big deal. I'll be honest, I have not done a ton of research into the football coaches, but I see you mentioned it. So just wanted to I will try to do some research when I do a bunch of um when I do more football breakdowns. Obviously, in the heat of basketball season, that's not something I have too much time to do. Um, in this one, I will let you guys know I am going to do a preview episode to break down the South Carolina game. My initial thoughts of that South Carolina game are, I think that Alabama, obviously should be able to win the game. I think that realistically, if you look at Ole Miss as being unable to score, South Carolina is even worse. South Carolina has just one game in conference that they've scored over 80 points. Uh, that's a problem, right? Like, we just talked about what it's taken for Alabama to be able to, or for teams to be able to beat Alabama this season. And just one team has been able to keep us inside of 80, and just one other team has been able to keep us inside of 90. Um, when they win the game. Obviously, if Alabama wins the game, it can be a little lower scoring. But still, there's not a ton where the scores are in the 80-point range, right? Like Alabama has the game against Kentucky where they scored just 89, the game against Oklahoma where they scored just 83. But realistically, Alabama's not in the 80s. 80s a ton. Oftentimes Alabama's been getting into the 90s this season, partially due to possessions and as well as their shooting splits. But I think that South Carolina, if you look at Ole Miss struggling, Ole Miss has currently, as of time of this episode, the 89th ranked offense in the country and the 63rd ranked defense, whereas South Carolina is 106 in offense and 102 in defense. The other piece that South Carolina has that Ole Miss was much better than South Carolina in this way. Ole Miss was a decent offensive rebounding team. They just were a pretty bad defensive rebounding team. South Carolina's a bad rebounding team. They're 278 in offense and 239 in defense. You know, the one thing that they do decently well is run teams off the 3-point line. They're only allowing like 34% of an opponent's attempts to be from the 3-point line. So I guess they're doing a decent job at that. They don't have a ton of size in the interior. Um, I mean, I guess they have a 7-footer that they can bring in, and they have some guys that have an ability. They just don't play a ton of real massive size in the interior. So I think the Alabama going inside is going to have a lot of success in this game. If you want me to be fully honest, I don't think that they have a shot blocker. I think that their defense is quite bad. Their offense is terrible as well. So honestly, I expected this to be a pretty big blowout in Coleman Coliseum on Saturday. I will be in attendance. My fiance will be in attendance. I know it's Valentine's Day. I convinced her to come to the game so that we could spend time together because I have season tickets and I thought it would be a good idea. But I am very excited for this game and what should be a very, very good game. Or, I expect Alabama to have a very good game in Coleman Coliseum against South Carolina. South Carolina, like I said, they've struggled this season. They currently are sitting at 2-9 in conference with wins just over LSU and Oklahoma. They do have a guy in Elijah Strong that you know, is their cash cow. He takes a ton of shots. You got a guy in Michi Johnson that fans should know very well. He has the most unique college path of all time, going from Ohio State to South Carolina to Ohio State to South Carolina. At this point, I guess he just has homes in both places. Quite funny. But in general, I think that Alabama did very, very well in this game, obviously against Ole Miss. I think that the game against South Carolina, I would expect to be the same. I will say at the beginning of the Ole Miss game, I was a little concerned. But then as that first half went on, it was pretty clear to me that Alabama was just missing shots. And, as Nate Oates says, if you're open, shoot it. I thought that Alabama was keeping its defensive intensity up. And the fact that Alabama was leading at halftime was a perfect example of the Nate Oates mantra that I don't think we've heard a ton this season, but we used to hear it a lot in seasons past. That he thinks that, the people say Alabama lives by the three and dies by the three. And his argument is the three shouldn't determine if you win the game, but it should determine by how much you win the game, right? If your intensity is good enough on defense, you should be able to win the game no matter what. And then if you make a bunch of threes, then of course you're going to win the game by even more. And I think that kind of showed in the first half. You saw that Alabama led at halftime. Was a small margin, but they were leading on the scoreboard at halftime. And then you see what happens in the second half when you actually make some threes. That margin goes from a 2-point margin up to a much larger margin. And so I think that that's like a perfect example of what Nate's talking about when he says that, with, like I said, Alabama being able to win the game and have the margin determined by the 3-point shot, but not the game determined by the 3-point shot. Have not seen it posted online yet who the hard hat winner is. But while we're waiting around, what kind of questions do you guys have? Whether it be about this game, whether it be about any of the future games, not just South Carolina. Obviously, Alabama plays South Carolina on Saturday, but then we got Arkansas and LSU and Mississippi State and others on the way. We have our return trip to Knoxville, to Athens. So I think there's a bunch of good games up ahead. But what kind of questions does anybody have? Chris Glenn saying Sherelle. I did mention that I thought that Sherelle's free throw shooting is a really big deal and how good he's been in conference. Shooting the free throw. He is currently sitting this season. He's at 71% from the free throw line. However, in conference, he's at 87% from the free throw line. Any day that you can get him to add on a three, I think it's a big deal. When you can have some offensive rebounds by him, obviously it's a big deal. I thought that his blocks came at very opportune times. I think that he was playing within himself, both attacking the basket, And I think that was, you're seeing a little bit more freedom of him like attacking the rim. You saw that starting with Charles Bediako coming in, but and the Aiden has continued that when he gets the ball on the perimeter, he's attacking downhill a little bit. So I think that that's a big deal. Miss Cindy says right now Alabama's sixth in the conference. Hope we can keep winning so we can get up to the top four. 100%. Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, that's always in my mind the goal that a team should set at a bare minimum. Nate Oates would look at it as you want to win the conference, and of course, but in my mind, the goal should be for the team to finish in top four in the SEC. You should get the double bye, and you should, that's what the goal should be. I think that obviously, currently as it sits, Alabama is tied with Vanderbilt in conference, and then teams ahead of them. We got Arkansas coming into Coleman Coliseum next week, week from today. Obviously, the rematch with Tennessee upcoming. And then Alabama has a lot of good chances for some big wins in the future, right? Alabama plays Georgia. Alabama plays LSU. Alabama plays last place SEC, South Carolina coming up. So Alabama has a ton of wins available to them. Currently South Carolina, LSU, Mississippi State, and Georgia and Auburn to that matter are all lower ranked than them in the SEC, right? So you got 4 games. Uh, uh, yeah, yeah, 4 games against teams that are lower ranked than you in conference currently, with the only 2 games against teams the same level or higher as Tennessee and Arkansas. So I think that puts you in a very good position to be able to finish, at potentially 13-5 or 12-6. Realistically, I think that 13-5 does get you top four in the SEC. 12-6, it's going to be close. But I think that if you can finish 13-5, if you can split, say your one loss is to Tennessee, say you're able to pull off the win at home against Arkansas and at home against Auburn, and you're able to win the rest with your one loss being against Tennessee. I think that Chris, you said you think that Sherelle won the hard hat per the conversation with Nate on the radio with Chris. Perfect. Yeah, so Aiden Sherelle winning that one. I mean, that would totally make sense. Aiden Sherelle in this game had a stat line of 3 offensive rebounds, 3 defensive rebounds, 2 blocks, of steal. I'm sure he had some deflections as well. I assumed it was either going to be him or Amari Allen, because Amari Allen also had 2 blocks and 3 steals. So I know Aiden Sherrill had more offensive rebounds, but Amari had more defensive. So I just wasn't sure which one ended up winning it. But if you're saying Aiden won it, that would make sense. I'm sure the score was very, very close on the hard hat points. Like I said, I'm thinking that it's a situation of Alabama's goal should be to get to 13-5, and I think if you can get to 13-5 in conference, that puts you in a very good chance to get a double bye. I think if you get to 12-6, like I said, I think you definitely have a chance, but I don't think it's guaranteed to be top four in the SEC. I think it's going to be tiebreakers if you get to 12-6. But 100%, I think the goal is to try to get top four. And unfortunately, you put yourself in a tough position. However, the schedule was front loaded with a lot of the games against some of the top teams in the SEC. Kentucky, you open the season with them. You faced a Vanderbilt team in the next game, and obviously losing the game at Texas or at home against Texas is the one that kind of jumps out, as Alabama should have been able to take care of that one. You'd be in a much better position had you been able to, but unfortunately they weren't able to. So now you're playing from behind, and you're really going to need to steal one. The one game that KenPom projects us to lose as of today is that Tennessee game on the road. They say the next hardest game is that Georgia game on the road, and then after that would be that Arkansas game at home. So thankfully, you at least have 4 of your next 7 at home, with 2 of the more difficult games being at home as well. Auburn and Arkansas both being at home. I think that's a really big deal. Yes, technically Georgia is higher, or it's going to be on the road versus Auburn's at home, but I think that Auburn does a little bit better, giving you troubles than Georgia potentially will. So I personally look at, kind of the difficulty of games, Tennessee being at the top of that list, probably Arkansas second, Auburn third, tied with Georgia. So that's probably our next four hardest games. Obviously, you can't drop a game to South Carolina. You can't drop a game to LSU. You can't drop a game to Mississippi State. Um, However, I do think that Alabama's ability to score, unlike most teams in the SEC, kind of as we talked about, 90 points is enough to beat those teams, right? Because similar to how we talked about with South Carolina, LSU is not great in offense. They're sitting at 52 in offense and over 100 in defense. And Mississippi State's 127 in offense. So they're one of the worst offensive teams. They may be the worst offensive team in the SEC. They are. They're statistically the worst team in offensive rating in the entire SEC. So, when you're comparing that to a team in Alabama that's currently number 2 in the country in offensive rating, at a certain point, yes, I hope that Alabama is able to step up its defense. I think that to win at the highest level against your Tennessees, in the future when Alabama has to play teams like Purdue and Gonzaga and Arizona again, you're going to have to step up your defense 100%, right? When you get into the SEC tournament, the NCAA tournament, Alabama's going to have to play better defense. However, I do think that in the SEC, and we talked about this in the preseason, in the SEC, there are going to be situations where Alabama is just going to be able to outscore people. Alabama's going to be able to score 90 and the other team just isn't, right? And I think that's what you saw today, right? You saw today a situation where AJ Storr tried to put the team on his back. He had 27 points and they still lost by 19 because the rest of the team had one double-digit score and he had 12. And I think that's kind of the situation that a lot of the teams in the SEC are going to get put in. Mississippi State is okay if Josh Hubbard has 40, but the rest of the team might have 40. So, right, that's where you start running into problems. What other questions do you guys have? This is going to be a fairly short stream. I don't want to go forever, but did want to do a little bit of a live stream since it was an away game, and I was able to do one with it being an early away game. This is a good one, Chris. So, how do we better defend the lob? Feels like we will see that more against the better front lines. I know it's been bad historically, but do we think the zone reappears? So, I think that that's a two-phased question. Answer one: do you see the zone appear? No. The only time that I've seen it this season was the one possession against Auburn that they hit the three. The only other time really in Nate Oates' tenure that you saw it was against Missouri, and Missouri lit it on fire. And I think that it's potentially hyperbole where it's like Nate is having he doesn't want to do it and then he does it and then it goes poorly and he's like, I knew I didn't want to do it, right? I think that's what's happening because I do think that the zone at times, if a team does it well, can be positive. But I think that Nate has had such bad times with the zone. It's similar to Nate talking about when he tried the press offense that Bucky McMillan runs. He talks about running it in high school and not having a lot of success, and so he immediately went away from it and went to the press defense, and he immediately went away from it. I look at zone very similar to that with Nate Oates. I think that Nate has considered it. And then when he runs it, it goes poorly. And he's like, all right, I'm not doing that. So I would highly doubt that we see the zone reappear. When you're talking about defending the lob, I think that a lot of that has to do with stopping the guy with the ball. Because oftentimes when you're seeing the lobs appear, it's due to penetration by the ball handler, right? You're seeing a situation where, like I know I saw it a couple of times today, where Corey Chest is matched up on Amari Allen, for example, and whoever it is that has the ball, I think Storr had the ball a couple of times, or there were different guys that had it. But Storr has the ball, and say he has LeBaron or whoever he has on him, right? They hit they do the pick and roll, and then as soon as the screen is set, as soon as that screen is set and somebody comes around the screen, our guys aren't doing a good enough job fighting under or over the screen based on the coverage that we're playing in that specific moment. And Amari Allen is having to replace, right? Is having to fill, or at least thinks he's having to refill, right? Maybe, if you were to ask Nate or Brian Adams, like, how are we supposed to play this perfectly? Maybe they're of the mindset, oh no, you're coming in early and you should have stayed with your man because you have to give them time to recover. Maybe that's the answer, right? Like I don't want to say that I know how they're exactly coaching it. But it is a situation where, to me, I think it's a situation where your Amaris or London or Aiden Sherrill is coming up thinking that they're going to block a curl because at least example for against Ole Miss, right? And I think that the reason you saw this against Texas A&M, but I think it was a different situation against Ole Miss. I think that we were coached all week. Ole Miss shoots a ton of mid-range twos. So if they're coming around that screen, assume that they're going to pull up, right? I think that that's how they coached it. And so if anybody was beat coming around the screen, I think that somebody else was trying to fill to replace so that they wouldn't get the mid range off and it was allowing the dunk on the back end, right? However, I don't think that that's going to be quite coached as big of a deal in some other games, right? When you're seeing that against Florida, it's a completely different issue, right? Obviously, the one guy that was able to have a little bit of success against A&M, I thought was a little bit different issue. In this specific game, I think it had more to do with how we were playing defense against them because we knew they were going to take a lot of mid range. Again, this team takes the most mid range in the entire country, so it was kind of expected that Ole Miss was going to do some of that. So I think that that had as much to do with what we saw today. When you're talking about the lobs against Florida and stuff, I think that Alabama just has to be more physical, contesting them. And I think that Alabama has to put more bodies on them. And honestly, I think it's also vocalizing on defense. I think that Alabama at times is too passive. I sit fairly close to the floor. I'm not on the floor or anything, but I'm close enough that I can hear them talking. And even in home games, it doesn't feel like there's enough defensive communication. And I think that sometimes that communication is what's causing the lobs to be able to come in on the back end. Cade, any updates on recruiting? I actually don't have any as of right now. I've been kind of trying to keep an eye on everything. The big one was obviously Caden Samuels having signed. That was one that we had heard kind of rumors about him signing during national signing period. You had seen some different things by Joe Tipton, Branham, and others had said, oh, there's a couple of guys every year that sign and don't announce. And it seemed like they were always talking about it with Samuels. Obviously, they didn't want to burn his spotlight and not let him be able to announce, but it seemed pretty clear to, at least to me as an outside observer, that that's what had happened. Then we obviously get confirmation after he officially announces that, yeah, he did sign in the early signing period. So I think that was the big one. That specifically coincided with the Chris Washington decommitment. And I think that, you saw Washington's decommitment and then you saw Samuels, Samuels didn't officially commit right then, but the staff got his signature right then. So those were tied in a very close way. Um, as of this moment, it's possible, Chris. I'm still of the mindset I'm going to be hopeful until we hear one way or the other on Caleb Holt. Um, I'm of the mindset that Nate Oates and Preston Murphy are going to do everything in their power to not let him leave the state. However, this is a top 5 player. This is a guy who is more than likely a one and done. Um, this is a guy who probably is of the mindset that he's going to be a one and done no matter where he goes to college. Um, and I think that as much as he has probably a very good relationship with Nate Oates, Nate Oates, it was even able to coach him a bit at Team USA. Tommy Lloyd was the coach for Team USA, right? So there are situations where I do think that I think that Arizona is probably the team that Alabama is competing with the most in this one. Um, are they going to be able to land him? We will see. Like I said, I'm of the mindset Preston and Nate are not going to let a top 5 player leave the state without the fight of a century. Um, and that's the big one, right? If he was from any other state, I would probably have chalked this one up to Arizona just because of how it's trending. But because this is an Alabama guy, I'm gonna have hope. I will say I'm not one way or the other. I'm not too concerned. I think that obviously high school talent is a big deal. And if you can get high level high school talent like Caleb Holt that's able to contribute at a high level, you're seeing it this season with the freshmen that have been able to contribute. I think that it's a massive, massive deal. However, I think that there is a world where obviously you can get some transfers that are going to make a big difference. I think additionally, older guards, oftentimes is something that your Latrell Wrightsels of the world, right? Somebody who's played a lot of time at Cal State Fullerton. You're able to bring him in. Your Mark Searses of the world, played multiple years at Ohio, right? Those type of guys are really what I think that you've seen Alabama be able to have some success with on at the guard front. Not to say that LeBaron Philon hasn't done well, right? Like obviously we've been successful in the guards in both ways, but I think that Alabama for guards, that's the one position where I'm not going to be that concerned, right? I think that Nate Oates' ability to get in guard talent and wing talent, I'm comfortable with, right? So even if Alabama isn't able to land Holt, I don't know that that's the one I'm the most concerned about. Obviously, would love to have him. Think that he would immediately make this team better. Um, but that's like I said, that's the one position where if Alabama is unable to land him, I feel confident that Nate and Preston are going to be able to get somebody that's very, very good in that position, one way or the other. So, yes, I'm starting to feel that way, but like I said, I'm going to hold out hope because I do think that Nate and Preston are going to still keep putting up a fight. Um, I think that Alabama is obviously in very good position for plenty of guards, and I think that you're starting to when you see guys like Amari Allen, and I think that Amari Allen is a perfect example of a guy that Alabama recruited and was underranked. Obviously, he was the top player in the state of Wisconsin, but he was underranked. He was a guy that a lot of people talked about as like, oh, he's somebody who hasn't played a lot of people, or yes, he's higher ranked in Wisconsin, but he's playing against a bunch of really bad competition. He's, I believe he was like in the 50s or 60s overall. He comes in and he's going to end up being a one and done this season, right? A lot of that's his maturity. In my mind, a lot of that's his body, just having the body and physicality to be able to rebound the basketball. Obviously, knowing how to rebound the basketball and do it at a high level, his ability to assist, his 3-point shot, just everything all encompassing. Amari Allen is perfect. And I think that guys like that are, um, something that Nate Oates is going to be able to use in the recruiting realms. And it's kind of what you saw with Noah Clowney. And I think it's the way that um, certain things are starting to go is I think that Nate Oates is of the mindset you really are only bringing in your high school talent that you think is going to make an immediate impact. And I think that's the reason why Terrace Bowie and Caden Samuels are the two guys that got brought in. Obviously, if Holt gets brought in, he's another one of those. But I think that gone are the days of bringing in a bunch of high school talent. I think that the only high school talent that you bring in, you expect them to play. And if they don't play, it's based on some, medical condition or something else that happens, right? It's outside of your control. But I think at the end of the day, this is all about like guys that are contribute day one. And I think that Samuels and Bowie are both that currently. But like I said, if I have any updates as it relates to recruiting, I'll let you guys know. I've not heard anything recently. Um, I can reach out to one of my friends that knows a little bit more about it than I do. Any other quick questions before I get out of here? As I said, I'm probably going to may try to record just a quick episode tomorrow. Probably won't be super long talking about South Carolina. Um, I will break down off-season on bigs. When you say better RBs, what do you mean? So in general, I'll go ahead and answer the question as it relates to bigs. Um, yes, but I think that the problem that we are rebounders. Gotcha. Um, yes. However, I think that what you need to understand when you look at something like this, I think that we talked about Corey Chest earlier. I think that Corey Chest is a great example, right? I think that you need to understand how Nate Oates is constructing a system and what players are asking for and what players want their role to be. Great example, like Mohamed Diabate, right? Mohamed Diabate was the rebound, was a great rebounder for us last season, was a good role player, was a small ball five, and he by all accounts had agreed to a deal to return to Alabama basketball, had not signed it, and then Kentucky offered a larger deal and he signs with Kentucky. Corey Chest was a guy who, from what we had heard, um, because of the Mohamed Diabate situation, Corey Chest came on campus. Alabama was trying to make Mohamed Diabate make a decision. When Mohamed Diabate agreed to the deal, from what I have heard, Corey Chest was like, okay, I'm going to seek other opportunities. Mohamed Diabate signs with Kentucky. Corey Chest ends up signing with Ole Miss. If the timing was different and Diabate says, "Hey, I'm leaving earlier," maybe Alabama lands Chest. Obviously, Chest didn't have a great game against Alabama today, but obviously, he also had 18 rebounds against Alabama last season, so we know what he's capable of as a rebounder. He's still not as huge of a body against as some guys who we're talking about. So I don't know that that fully fixes the problem, but I think that somebody like that could have potentially helped. I think an additional one when you're talking about bigs, I think that you have to understand the situation, um, that Alabama thought that they were putting an emphasis on bigs by adding um, Noah. Noah was brought in as a player of the year in his league that led their league in scoring and was one of the better rebounders in their league. Could pass, could shoot the three, potentially could play the four while Aiden played the five if you need to play two bigs. And quite frankly, he just hasn't contributed in the way that Alabama expected him to. Right? I don't want to be completely rude, but like Alabama expected him to be that guy, and he just hasn't been. Right? You brought in a player of the year in another league, and he just has not been the guy who you thought he was going to be. Obviously, that league was not nearly as good as what you think it was going to be, or there's plenty of reasons, but I think that he was brought in to be a backup for Aiden Sherrill, and he's just not been that. I think Alabama knew that he wasn't going to be that, and that's why Alabama brought in a guy in Collins, which I obviously did not expect to play. And I was pretty open about that fact. But I thought that Alabama thought that they would at least have him for some spare minutes, worst case scenario. And if nothing else, he could give you some extra fouls. I mean, the thing that I think that people need to be aware of is, do y'all understand who our bigs were in our Final Four run? You could make an argument one of the bigs was Grant Nelson, right? He played the four for us, but he was really one of the bigs. Sure. Obviously, I think he's better than just about anybody we have today. But the other two bigs were Nick Pringle and Muhammad Wagi, right? So this isn't a Nate Oates' offense and Nate Oates' ability to go far has even been able to be done with subpar play in the post. I think Aiden Sherrill is a better option than either Muhammad Wagi or Nick Pringle. I think that Aiden Sherrill as a rim protector is probably better than Grant Nelson. Grant Nelson obviously gave you a little bit more athleticism with less size. He was obviously able to play massive games, and like the North Carolina game, he was massive in that one to get you to the Elite Eight and eventually to the Final Four. But I think that Alabama thought that they were trying to get better in the bigs this year. I think additionally, because of how Alabama plays and the fact that they do play small ball, I think that Alabama struggles with the ability to get multiple bigs. I think that Alabama's big win in the offseason this year was keeping Aiden Sherrill. Because from what I've heard, there was a lot of back channeling to try to get Aiden Sherrill to enter the portal. So the fact that Alabama was able to keep Aiden Sherrill was a huge deal. And then Alabama, again, thought that they were bringing in a player of the year as a big that you knew you couldn't bring in a top talent big because Alabama doesn't play two bigs. Alabama's offense isn't predicated on two bigs, and you're not going to pay Aiden Sherrill a crazy amount of money and have another big that requires that amount of, top end talent. Um, I think that there's been plenty of bigs that Alabama has gone after, and I think the style is sometimes scaring people from wanting to go to Alabama, um, just because of how they play on offense and the time that they're going to get. I think that Nate's pretty honest with them as it relates to playing time, and I think that some players are wanting more of a guarantee as it relates to playing time than Nate's willing to give them. Um, so I think that's what the issue is when it relates to bigs, but I don't think that that's something that fully can be fixed, right? I think that it's really just a situation of, if you replaced, let's say you currently replaced Noah Williamson with Nick Pringle. So not even a guy that's able to shoot the three, right? Let's say you replace Noah Williamson with Nick Pringle. You have a guy that can do a lob target and you have a guy that can at least defend the post. Y'all would feel much better about your current situation as it relates to big men. And Nick Pringle's not, he's not Trey Kaufman-Wren. He's not Oscar Clough. He's not Graham Ike. He's not, Chinyalu. So I think that that's a situation. I think that, we're looking at it pretty poorly this season because of what situation we've been put in. But I think even that Final Four season, a lot of people may point to that one as like, oh, that one had a bad centers as well. So obviously Alabama doesn't have an ability to recruit centers. You do know the reason the centers were bad that year was because of Charles Bediako staying in the draft. Had he not gotten some of the worst advice anyone has ever gotten ever and stayed in the draft, Alabama would have used him at the 5, Grant Nelson at the 4, and you would have had Nick Pringle as your backup, and Muhammad Wagee would have never been on that team because Muhammad Wagee was only on that team because you had to have another center because you couldn't just play Nick Pringle and Grant Nelson. What happened if somebody got injured? Right? So if that team has Charles Bediako and Grant Nelson and then Nick Pringle as well, you feel great about that front court. Unfortunately, you weren't able to do that, and I think that that's kind of the situation that you're in. I think that, unfortunately, that situation in the Final Four year, then you look at last season, I think that last season, you did Cliff was good, but I don't think he was quite exactly what you originally expected early in the season. I think that Aiden Sherrill got better as the season went on, but I thought that maybe you wanted something more from him earlier. But last season, the bigs were not quite as good as you hoped they would be. And then as well, then you look at this season, I think that you have to look at the fact that Alabama, again, they tried. And I think that the injuries to Keaton Bristow, I think, is impacting your ability to think how big we could be because that's a guy who's 6'9", 6'10", and is not on the floor. I don't think he would be your 5-man, but if you played Florida with him, say you played Florida with, at the time you had Bediako, but let's say you play Florida with Bediako, Aiden Sherrill, Keaton Bristow, Amari Allen, right? Like that's a pretty physical front court. I still think Florida was just dominating that game, and there wasn't a whole lot you could do about it. I thought that they took it to Alabama, and that had as much to do with Boogie Fland and their ability to cause turnovers. Alabama had so many turnovers in that game, it wouldn't have mattered what the front court was doing. But right, I think that Alabama has an ability. And I think that some of the injuries has caused some of the problems. So I think that's tainting how we view this this season. All right. Been going on about an hour. Want to quickly let you guys know if y'all are not currently subscribed to the channel, if you could do me a favor and subscribe, we would appreciate it. As always, my pregame thread on Saturday will drop Saturday morning. It's going to have the breakdown of South Carolina as well as my player to watch and my score prediction. We'll be putting out an episode tomorrow breaking down South Carolina as well. If you're interested in the written content and you don't follow me on Twitter, if you check out barnesonbama.com, I post the article there as well. For anybody that's interested, it also has the full length episodes of the podcast. So if you're ever interested, you can check that out. Really appreciate all the support this year. It's been a great year. I know we're on the push to 1,000 subscribers. We're just under. 9:30 right now. So anything y'all can do to help me out, I would appreciate. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. It really does mean the world to me, and I will catch y'all in the next episode. Peace.